17 years of raising you was just a failed investment. Pack your bags. Those were the words my adoptive father spat across the kitchen table one spring morning. No shouting, no trembling voice, just cold finality, as if he were dismissing an employee who didn't meet quarterly expectations. My mother sat beside him, her diamond rings catching the sunlight, nodding in quiet agreement. That was the moment my world split open. My name is Michelle. On paper, I was the lucky one. Adopted into a wealthy suburban family in Connecticut, raised in a mansion where everything gleamed with perfection. My father was a high-powered corporate lawyer. My mother, an interior designer who catered to clients so rich their homes ended up in glossy magazines. To neighbors, we looked like the ideal American family. Inside those walls, though, I was never a daughter. I was an accessory, a project, a piece of their curated image. For years, I sacrificed pieces of myself just to fit the mold. I stayed up until midnight chasing perfect grades, believing maybe academic excellence would earn their love. When I handed my father a report card filled with A's, he never once said good job, only that's what we expect. I stuffed away my messy notebooks of short stories, ashamed of the imagination they dismissed as childish nonsense. I silenced my love of writing because to them, it wasn't profitable, and therefore it wasn't real. I even tried to mirror their flawless order, folding my clothes into rigid lines, hiding the colorful chaos of who I really was, only to be met with that same disappointed shake of the head. And yet, no matter what I gave, it was never enough. I wasn't blonde, I wasn't their blood, and deep down, I think they always saw me as temporary. The day they revealed the truth, that I was adopted, wasn't an embrace of honesty. It was a weapon, a final excuse to cast me out. I remember sitting in that kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee and polished wood mixing with the sting of betrayal. 17 years of sacrifice erased with a single sentence. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. But as I walked upstairs to pack my bags, one question burned hotter than the shame. If they could discard me so easily, what else had they been hiding? When people look at photographs of my childhood, they see privilege. A sprawling colonial house with its white columns glowing under the Connecticut sun, manicured lawns trimmed as sharp as a military haircut, and shiny black luxury cars parked in the driveway. In every picture, my parents wear polished smiles. My father's tie knotted perfectly, my mother's pearl earrings catching the light. I'm there too, always in the middle, always smiling. But what the camera never captured was the weight pressing down on me, the sacrifices I made every single day just to belong in a family that never truly claimed me. I gave up sleep first. Nights in that cavernous house were eerily silent, except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock echoing down the hallway. While my parents sipped wine in their private study, I was at my desk, hunched over textbooks under the harsh glow of a desk lamp. Midnight would creep past, my eyes burning, fingers cramped around a pencil, but I pushed through, convinced that perfect grades could unlock the affection they withheld. When I finally presented my father with a report card full of A's, he didn't smile. He didn't hug me. He simply glanced down and muttered, "That's what we expect." I sacrificed joy next. On Saturday afternoons, when other kids raced bikes or ate ice cream that dripped down their wrists, I sat in my room organizing binders. My mother despised disorder. My bed had to be made so tight you could bounce a coin on it, my bookshelf lined like soldiers. My room became a stage set, curated to please her. And yet, no matter how carefully I stacked my notebooks, the one corner where I hid my sketch pads and unfinished stories gave me away. The sight of those scribbled pages was enough for her voice to sharpen. "Why can't you be more disciplined, Michelle? This artistic nonsense won't get you far. I even sacrificed my health. My body begged for rest, for warmth, for comfort. Instead, I dragged myself through endless extracurriculars, debate club, Model UN, advanced placement courses, programs my parents treated as investments, not passions. My father drove me hard, the hum of his BMW filling the silence as he lectured, "You need to think about optics. Yale, law school, that's the plan. Always his plan. By 16, migraines clawed at my skull, but aspirin and forced smiles became part of my routine. And perhaps the cruelest sacrifice was emotional. I gave away every ounce of myself trying to be worthy of love that never arrived. I bit back my words when conversations turned sharp. I swallowed my disappointment when birthdays felt staged for their colleagues, not for me. I taught myself not to expect hugs at bedtime or gentle encouragement before a test. I told myself their cold nods and clipped remarks were still something, better than nothing. The contrast was unbearable. Outside, the house gleamed like a dream, chandeliers spilling golden light across marble floors. Guests marveled at the design, at the curated perfection. But inside me, darkness, a constant sense of being an intruder in my own home. I remember once standing at the top of the staircase, listening. Down below, my parents laughed with their guests, crystal glasses clinking, the piano playing softly in the background. From where I stood, I felt invisible, as if I were a ghost haunting their perfect tableau. Cinematically, I can still picture the split screen of my life. On one side, the driveway, lined with manicured hedges, neighbors waving politely at the successful marshals, their adopted daughter smiling at their side. On the other, me, alone in my room, the pale glow of my laptop illuminating a tear-streaked face as I wrote stories about lost children searching for homes they never had. The more I gave, the less I felt I belonged. Sacrifice was supposed to buy closeness, wasn't it? That's what I told myself as I pushed harder, ran faster, studied longer. But no matter how many pieces of myself I offered up, time, health, dreams, love, the space between us only widened. By 17, the sacrifices had piled so high they crushed me. Each one left a scar. Sleepless nights etched under my eyes, unspoken words lodged in my throat, journals hidden like contraband. I began to wonder, if I had already given everything, what more could they possibly want? And worse, if love required this much sacrifice, had it ever been love at all? The morning after my 17th birthday, sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows, warm and golden. For a fleeting second, I thought maybe today would feel different. Maybe my parents would finally see me, not as an investment, but as their daughter. Instead, I found them waiting at the table, dressed sharply, like they were heading to a business meeting. Their eyes were cold, their posture rigid. "Sit down, Michelle," my father said, his tone clipped, rehearsed. I lowered myself into the chair, the wood feeling colder than it should have. My mother's diamond rings flashed as she folded her hands neatly on the table, her face composed, unreadable. My father cleared his throat. "Your mother and I have been discussing your behavior." 17 years of effort, of sacrifice, and frankly, the returns are diminishing. His words hit like a slap. Returns. As if I were a stock that had failed to perform. He didn't pause. "We've fulfilled our obligation. You're adopted, Michelle, and it's time you start finding your own way." For a moment, the world went silent. The clock on the wall ticked, but even that sound seemed distant. My chest tightened, my ears rang. Adopted. Not whispered as a secret or shared as a moment of truth, but weaponized, coldly thrown across the table to justify discarding me. 17 years of sleepless nights, of perfect grades, of biting my tongue to please them, erased in one sentence. I sat frozen, hands trembling under the table. My mother smoothed her dress and added with a voice as sharp as glass, "Pack your things. By noon, we expect you gone. Just like that. I stared at them, searching for some sign of hesitation, some flicker of parental love. Nothing. My father slid a folded check across the table. "This should cover your immediate needs for 6 months. After that, you're on your own." His tone was businesslike, as if we were negotiating a contract, not ending a childhood. My mouth was dry, words stuck in my throat. For years I had given everything: sleep, joy, health, dreams, believing love would eventually follow. But love had never been part of the deal. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was a transaction, a temporary asset they could discard when the numbers didn't add up. The humiliation burned hotter than tears. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but all I could do was nod. I understand. My voice sounded foreign, mechanical. My calmness seemed to unsettle them. Perhaps they had expected begging, sobbing, desperation. But I felt hollow, like my soul had stepped outside my body and left me watching from a distance. Inside, though, the pain was unbearable. Memories of every sacrifice flashed like cruel reminders. The late nights bent over textbooks, the birthday candles blown out with no real wish, the secret notebooks I kept hidden because my passion was never good enough. Years of trying to be theirs. And now, one phrase: you're adopted, you're on your own. If you're listening to this and feel that sharp sting in your chest, if betrayal has ever knocked the air out of you, then you understand. And if this story makes you ache the way it still aches for me, please, hit that like button, just so I know you're still here, still walking through this moment with me. The minutes after that conversation blurred together. I went upstairs. The sound of my footsteps heavy on the polished wood, my vision fogged with disbelief. My room, the place I had spent countless nights sacrificing for their approval, suddenly looked like a stranger's space. The posters on the walls, the books lined neatly, the expensive watch they had gifted me the night before. It all felt staged, meaningless. I opened my closet and pulled out my backpack, stuffing clothes and toiletries with shaking hands. Each zipper that closed sounded final, like another door shutting in my face. I placed my journal inside, the one where I had secretly recorded their suspicious dealings, their hushed phone calls, the documents I had quietly copied. But at that moment, even the truth I carried felt powerless. The house was too quiet. From downstairs came the faint shuffle of pages, the click of my father's phone, my mother flipping through a magazine as if nothing monumental had happened. Their indifference was worse than shouting. It was confirmation. I had never really belonged. When I finally walked back down with my bags, I placed the house key on the table. My father didn't look up from his screen. My mother's eyes flicked toward me, then away. "I won't need your money," I whispered, leaving the check untouched. Neither of them moved. Neither of them tried to stop me. I stepped out into the spring air. The sun was blinding. Birds chirped cheerfully in the manicured trees. The contrast was cruel. Outside, the world was blooming. Inside me, everything was collapsing. For 17 years, I had sacrificed everything I could, and in return, I had been told I was nothing. As I walked down that driveway for the last time, duffel bag heavy on my shoulder, a single thought pulsed in my mind. Maybe this was the end of everything. Maybe this was how it all ended for me, discarded, unwanted, stripped of family and future in a single morning. I didn't yet know what secrets I carried. I didn't yet know the storm that evidence in my backpack would unleash. All I knew then was this. At 17, I had lost it all. I thought being thrown out was the end of their cruelty. I thought nothing could cut deeper than being told I was nothing but a failed investment. I was wrong. A few weeks later, while I was still trying to piece together a life at Jennifer's house, I heard from a former teacher. She'd been contacted by my adoptive parents. They weren't just washing their hands of me, they were rewriting the story. They told people I was unstable, ungrateful, rebellious, that I had run away because I couldn't handle their expectations. They even hinted that Jennifer's family had manipulated me, poisoned me against them. It was betrayal all over again, this time not just emotional, but reputational. They had taken my sacrifices and twisted them into accusations. The straight A's I had bled for, dismissed as pressure she couldn't handle. My quiet rebellion, wanting to study journalism instead of law, painted as proof of immaturity. They were stripping me not only of home, but of credibility. At first I broke. Nights in Jennifer's guest room, I curled up under borrowed blankets, tears soaking the pillow. I was 17, with no real plan, and now even my story wasn't mine anymore. They had money, influence, power. They could destroy me with whispers before I'd even had a chance to fight back. But somewhere inside that darkness, something shifted. The grief calcified into anger, and anger gave me focus. I pulled out my journal, the one I had filled with notes about their late-night calls, the offshore accounts, the adoption documents I had photographed. For months I'd carried those secrets like a burden. Now I saw them as a weapon. They thought I was powerless, but I wasn't. The first act of defiance came unexpectedly. My parents showed up unannounced at Jennifer's house one Sunday afternoon. I can still see their black SUV gleaming in the driveway, a symbol of everything they valued. Jennifer's mother opened the door, startled. Behind her, I froze, my hands trembling. For a moment, the old instinct to shrink, to disappear, almost won. "Michelle," my father said, stepping inside without invitation. His voice was tight, controlled. My mother followed, clutching her designer purse like armor. "You've caused quite a lot of trouble," he began, eyes narrowing. "Skipping school, spreading lies, embarrassing us in front of colleagues. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" His words dripped with authority, the same tone he used in courtrooms. For years, that tone silenced me. My chest tightened, my palms went slick. I felt 17 again, small, weak, desperate. But then, something inside me hardened. I remembered the check he'd slid across the table, the words, "We've fulfilled our obligation." I remembered my mother's cold voice, "Pack your things." And I realized I had nothing left to lose. "This family?" I said, my voice shaking at first. "You mean the one that threw me out like trash? The one that decided I wasn't worth keeping?" My mother's lips tightened. "We gave you everything. And this is how you repay us, by trying to smear us, by sneaking into private files?" Ah, so they knew, or at least suspected. My heart thudded, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I didn't smear you," I said, steadier now. "I told the truth. The truth about who I am, about what you've done." My father stepped closer, looming. "Careful, Michelle. You don't understand the consequences of playing games you can't win." The old fear surged, but I clenched my fists under the table. For years I had given them my silence. Not anymore. "You're right," I said quietly. "I don't understand all of it. But I understand enough. Offshore accounts, Cayman holdings, golden futures. Does that sound familiar?" For the first time their composure cracked. My father's eyes flickered, my mother's face drained of color. That was my mini-victory. My first reversal. For a split second, I thought they might lunge forward, take my journal, silence me. Instead, they exchanged a glance, the kind that said, "She knows more than we thought." "You don't know what you're talking about," my mother snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. "Yes, I do," I said, no longer trembling, "and I've made copies." "Evidence. So if anything happens to me, if you try to shut me down, you won't just lose me, you'll lose everything." The room was thick with silence. Jennifer's parents stood behind me, tense, protective. My father's jaw worked as if he were biting back the urge to shout. Finally, he turned sharply toward the door. "This isn't over," he muttered. And then they were gone, the SUV roaring out of the driveway like a wounded animal retreating. When the door shut, my knees almost buckled. Jennifer caught my arm. "You were amazing," she whispered. Amazing. I didn't feel amazing. I felt drained, trembling, half sick with fear, but beneath it all, something fierce flickered to life. For the first time, I had stood my ground. For the first time, they had looked at me and seen not a weak little girl, but a threat. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the confrontation again and again. Their faces when I said the words, "golden futures," the fear behind their denial. The truth was a weapon, and I held it now. I realized then, the years of sacrifice had not been wasted. They had made me observant, disciplined, resourceful. Everything they had forced onto me, I could now use against them. And so I made a decision. No more tears in the dark. No more silence. I would not let them erase me, not again. If they wanted war, I was ready. From that night forward, I was no longer the girl begging to belong. I was the girl who would fight back. The first real breath of freedom came not with a shout, but with the quiet click of a file uploading. I sat in the university library, the glow of my laptop screen reflecting in my eyes as I forwarded everything I had gathered: the offshore transfers, the adoption documents, the timeline of suspicious payments, to Sarah, my attorney. Within hours, the information was in the hands of investigators. For months, I had carried the truth like a secret weight. Now it was out in the open, alive, unstoppable. News spread quickly. The Bar Association launched a full audit into my father's law practice. Whispers of money laundering turned into formal accusations. My mother's design firm, once the pride of high-end magazines, was revealed as a shell for hidden funds. Colleagues who once toasted them at galas now crossed the street to avoid them. For the first time, the world saw them as I had always known them: cold, calculating, and greedy. I remember sitting in a courtroom gallery, my heart steady as my father stood before the judge. His face, once so composed, was lined with panic. His voice, the same one that had commanded boardrooms and silenced me for years, cracked as charges were read: wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. My mother sat beside him, eyes darting, her hands clenched so tightly the diamonds cut into her skin. This was the face behind the mask, the desperation of people whose power was crumbling. And me? I didn't flinch. I didn't tremble. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the child waiting for their approval. I was the witness to their downfall, the girl they had tried to discard now standing unbroken. Liberation wasn't just legal, it was personal. After years of living in a house that felt like a prison, I finally created a space of my own. My dorm room was small, cluttered with books and sticky notes, but it was mine. I hung fairy lights above the bed, opened the windows wide, and let the morning sunlight spill across my desk. That first Saturday, I walked to a diner with Jennifer and Kate. We ordered pancakes stacked high with syrup, bacon sizzling on the side, and I laughed until my stomach hurt. It was the kind of breakfast my old family would have sneered at, too messy, too ordinary. To me, it tasted like freedom. Warmth began to replace the coldness that had defined my childhood. Neighbors who had once only waved politely stopped to offer kind words. "We saw the news," one told me. "You were brave to stand up." Jennifer's parents treated me like their own, sliding an extra plate onto the dinner table without hesitation. At school, professors encouraged me. Classmates cheered when my first investigative article was published. Slowly, the world reminded me that family could be chosen and love could be real. The final act of release came one quiet afternoon. I returned to Jennifer's house to help her mother tidy the garden. Kneeling in the dirt, sun on my back, I realized my hands weren't trembling anymore. The fear that once lived in my bones had burned away. I was no longer the girl staring at locked file cabinets in terror, or the child silenced at the dinner table. I was a young woman who had faced betrayal, uncovered truth, and chosen to live on her own terms. As I wiped sweat from my brow, I whispered words that surprised even me. "They don't own me anymore." That night, I sat by my window with a notebook open, pages blank and waiting. Outside, the streetlights glowed and somewhere a neighbor's dog barked. Life was imperfect, noisy, real, and I welcomed it. I began to write, not for approval, not for performance, but for myself. From humiliation to liberation, the journey had been brutal. But as the ink flowed across the page, I understood being cast out had set me free, and in that freedom, I finally found home. I used to believe freedom was something you earned by pleasing others, by sacrificing sleep, health, and even your own dreams just to be worthy of love. But I was wrong. Freedom came the moment I stopped begging for it, the moment I chose to walk away. One afternoon, after the trials and the noise had begun to fade, I found myself sitting in a small cafe near campus. The sun streamed through the window, painting golden streaks across the table. A plate of warm apple pie rested in front of me, the crust flaky, the filling sweet. It was nothing extravagant, nothing my old family would have ever served at their polished dinner parties. But to me, it was everything. A taste of life lived on my own terms. I took the first bite and laughed softly to myself. For the first time in years, the laugh wasn't forced, wasn't measured. It was mine. Later, walking back through the tree-lined street, I tilted my face toward the sky. The spring air was crisp, the light spilling over me like a promise. I no longer carried the weight of their expectations or the sting of their rejection. Instead, I carried my own choices, my own voice. The girl who once trembled under their scrutiny now walked steady, head held high. That was the true liberation, not the downfall of those who betrayed me, but the rising of the self they could never destroy. When I sit at my desk at night now, pen scratching across paper, it isn't out of desperation to prove myself. It's because storytelling is who I am. The chaos of my notebooks, the creativity they tried to shame me for, those are the very things that saved me. And as I close my journal and glance at the simple string lights glowing above my bed, I realize I am no longer a product of their rejection. I am the author of my own beginning. To anyone listening who has ever felt discarded, silenced, or unwanted, remember this: sometimes the door that closes with cruelty is the very door that leads you to freedom. Family isn't defined by blood or wealth or contracts. It's defined by love, honesty, and the people who stand beside you when the world turns dark. If you believe, like I do, that justice still finds its way, and that every ending can hide a new beginning, please hit like and subscribe. Not just for this story, but for every story that reminds us we are stronger than betrayal and freer than fear.